In this project, we used something a little bit different to manage our project. We used Agile and Scrum, and in this video, we'll talk a little bit about how that worked for us and what our participants learned. Every project needs to be managed. That means that we have to decide what to do, when to do it, and who is going to do it. There are a lot of standard ways of doing this, and in a lot of the projects that we've written and we've seen, people use things like Gantt charts and others to manage projects. This tends to be a project management form that's very linear. That is, that one thing follows another. And we know that in our projects that very often things are not linear. They have to be done not in sequence, but in parallel. And that's what we tried to do using Agile and Scrum. We used Agile because we believe that it gave us a significant flexibility in doing a project that had a lot of participants and a lot of moving parts, so to speak. And then also something we couldn't have anticipated, which was the pandemic, which made it even more interesting and made Agile even more important to our project. In our first project meeting in Riga in March of 2020, we had to decide on a set of issues, and one of those major issues was infrastructure. And the infrastructure we're talking about is the IT infrastructure that's needed to deliver esports and e-games in a tournament form. Then we also had to talk about things like when to deliver tournaments and then how to publicize these events. And those are things that we divided up in the very first meeting. Once we did that, once we had divided into teams and decided on the major steps for our project, we used an Agile tool called User Stories. And in the next section, we will talk just a little bit about it, User Stories. And then we decided what the user stories were for each of the individual tasks that we decided on. And then we tried in our short time to learn everything that we needed so we could do this project. So what are user stories? User stories assume that at the end of creating a product or a project that we will have a customer, and that customer will want to see some feature, some activity that gives them value. So we create a story that says, for example, as a tournament participant, I want to be able to understand when and where to log in so that I can be of biggest use to my team. And that's an example of a user story, and we created user stories for all of our major activities. This is an example of a card that we would create, and we created to write out our user stories so that everybody would agree on them. And then at the end, we had at the very bottom, as you'll see, is an acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria means how do we know when we're done? And this is something that's very important, of course, because when we're creating small pieces of a project, we have to decide, okay, this means done. Another major part of Agile is a thing called Scrum. Scrum comes to us from rugby, where you see a lot of players all together in the center pushing the ball back and forth. It's an Agile process that kind of allows teams to deliver the most value to their customers. And it allows everybody to be able to rapidly and often inspect the actual results of the project to that point. So we have leaders that set priorities, and then the teams self-organize to determine the best way to deliver the biggest priority features, the biggest priority things that the project needed. We saw this as particularly valuable for teams when they were creating tournaments, especially in creating the publicity for the tournaments. As you can see, Scrum is a tool that's been used in a lot of places, primarily around IT, and the reason we chose this is because a lot of our participants, of course, are interested in IT as a future job or career, and by understanding at least the outlines of Scrum, Agile, that they would be ready to at least understand what's expected of them in the job market. This is a diagram that shows the overall flow of work in Agile. We used only parts of this because we didn't meet as often as an Agile team usually meets, which is once a day, but we met at tournaments and then online as it was possible. So we had longer sprints and longer work cycles, but still we used these things to create smaller portions of work rather than big parts of work and things that we could use immediately. Finally, we had to have a way to track the work we were doing, and this we used a Kanban board. In sort of the good old days when Agile was first born, people used Post-it notes on a board, and they would bring it along the board process to show where they were. Backlog are tasks that need to be done. People can choose work from the backlog. And then they move it to in progress, which means that somebody is working on it. Then to peer review, so that somebody looks at it and says, yeah, this meets the acceptance criteria. Then we test it to make sure that it does meet the criteria, and then it moves to done. And sometimes when some task is not really moving along as quickly as we think it should, then we consider it blocked, and then we have to decide what to do. At the end of it all, we were quite happy with what we saw and what we were able to do. We exposed our participants to a new tool for creating and for delivering projects. They seemed to enjoy it and they seemed to get something out of it. At the last tournament in Prague, we did a short survey of what people learned about Agile. And the biggest thing that came through is that there are two things. First of all, that people understood that projects are not easy to deliver, that they're big work. And that second, when you divide the work into smaller pieces, it becomes much easier. And Agile is at root a way of delivering a project by dividing it into smaller pieces that can be worked on as a team.